I think many of us share the privilege and the gift and the joy of having had a conversation partner in Silke who has always also treated painting as a discourse. My paper, The Making of Remaking, is based accordingly on our long-term exchange, especially on a conversation we held in 2019 for the publication Material Matters, Painting and Its Materialities, edited by Sigrid Sandström. When asked how the motives in her pictures relate to the painting process, Silke answered, quote, "I may start with a specific reference to a piece of choreography or stage design, for example, but once I start working on it, I lose and find the motive, shift it from a photographic space into a physical space. The material is crucial to this process, but the work is not medium specific, not about the material itself. Instead, the specific qualities of the material allow me to enter into a process that determines the way the painting evolves." End of quote. This statement is remarkable in two respects and serves as a starting point for my reading of Silke's choreographic images. Firstly, the fact that she loses her references to historical choreographies and stage sets found in photographs during and within the painting process. This means that the figures and stages that we recognize in her paintings were not painted mimetically, but were created throughout the painting process. The second aspect that I would like to pursue in my lecture is the explicit demarcation of and from medium specificity. In doing so, the artist spoke out against the formalist credo of the anti-illusionistic treatment of optical surfaces and the emphasis on flatness. But which medium concept did she then propagate? Especially given her choice of motifs and the manner in which they are placed and hung, it makes sense to conclude from Silke's paintings that the term theatricality, which has long been used pejoratively in the visual arts, could be re-evaluated in a positive sense. Of course, this is now the consensus, especially in post-formalist art. As most of you might know, this famous, infamous term is associated with the name of US-American art historian Michael Fried, who accused minimal art of theatricality in his 1967 book, Art and Objecthood. On the one hand, Fried criticized the dependence of artworks on the physical presence of their viewers. Secondly, he rejects the in-between arts, the transmedial character, as well as the ambiguous and hybrid genres of minimalistic type of works. From the importance of the interaction between work and viewer, which becomes visible in Milan's exhibition concept through the inclusion of spatial pillars, visual axes, and artificial light, one could justifiably conclude a programmatic theatricality insofar as the form of the work's presentation refigures Silke's choreographic as well as scenographic motives. At the same time, it is my counter-argument that the interweaving of figuration and decor speaks against an unbroken analogy with minimalistic theatricality insofar as this was subject to the requirement of aesthetic neutrality and radical reduction in the sense of geometric abstraction. This is contrasted with an obviously programmatic ornamentalization of figuration in Silke's painting, a stylistic language for which I argue with regard to Emmeline Butterfield-Rosen's 2021 book, Modern Art and the Remaking of Human Condition, on the importance of frontality, lack of gestures, and lack of expression in that ballet, among other things that appears repeatedly in Silke's paintings. I'm talking about the ballet russe, which the American art historian examined alongside George Seurat's Le Poseuse and Gustav Klimt's Beethoven frieze, using the example of Václav Nijinsky's interpretation of Claude Debussy's symphonic poem Prélude à l'après-midi d'une femme, premiered in 1912 in Paris, which was based on Stéphane Mallarmé's poem L'après-midi d'une femme. Even if I'm not concerned with this specific piece, it seems to me that there is a comparison with the anti-theatrical, because frontal, gesture-poor, and expressionless representation of the body that Butterfield-Rosen, analysis in painting and dance around 1900, as an expression of a departure from the primacy of humanistic iconography traditions. According to one of her central theses, a movement and activation of the body coming from outside has taken the place of an inspiration and animation conceived within the subject. Butterfield-Rosen locates this outside in the expansion of industrial machines, in photography, in the newly created silent film, as well as in scientific, philosophical, and psychological discourses that ranged from Darwin's theory of evolution to Nietzsche's cult of Greek antiquity to Freud's theories of the unconscious. Discourses that were designed to think of human beings less as spiritual beings, superior to their bodies, and more as techno-organic creatures controlled by uncontrollable impulses and forces. Butterfield-Rosen's reflections on the significance of the remaking of human condition for modern art are relevant to me here insofar as Silke has repeatedly used photographs of the ballet russe, founded by Sergei Diaghilev in 1909, including Bronislava Nijinska's choreographies. Bronislava Nijinska was a fellow dancer in Diaghilev's troupe, and as Butterfield-Rosen's book shows, Václav Nijinsky secretly rehearsed with his sister archaic Greek forms, such as vases, in the family living room in St. Petersburg. They would spend all evening long on the floor in front of the mirror trying out different poses. In fact, attempting to approximate the human figure to static objects and decorative pattern required a significant number of rehearsals. They are said to have been around 120 for Afternoon of a Faun, which was unusually large number for a ballet of that time. This gives me a second keyword that is important for my reading of Silke's paintings, that of the rehearsal, about whose importance for her working method we talked a lot and about which I have been published on various occasions. Okay. Thank you. On the one hand, because a number of the photographs used by Silke are documentations of dance rehearsals. On the other hand, because the blurring of the rehearsal and performance remained a characteristic of those dance avant-gardes that referred to the ballet russe. Here you see the receptions by Silke, how she referred to Les Noces, of a piece of which also she used photographs of the rehearsals. And right now I would like to refer to another really very important concept of dance, to that of Yvonne Rainer, which Silke repeatedly studied and which were created as part of the New York Judgens Dance Theater. Of course, this reference brings us back to the US-American minimalism of the 1960s and 70s, in the context of which the choreographer and dancer and filmmaker published her programmatic manifesto, a quasi-survey of some minimalist tendency in the quantitatively minimal dance activity midst the plethora, or an analysis of Trio A in the year 1968. Consisting of a tabular comparison of aspects of so-called minimalist sculpture and new forms of dance, industrial production is discussed with the use of uniform forms and modules, as well as with principles of energy balancing, found movement, and the equality of parts in dance. Significantly, the principles of uniformity and equality was accompanied by exactly the reduction in gestures and poses diagnosed by Butterfield Rosen around 1900. Rainer's ensemble was also characterized by a large number of rehearsals which involved a systematic de-learning of conventional physical expression. For example, the 1972 film Lives of Performers, which I will show you a short clip of, is a mixture of documentation and staging of rehearsals, which at the same time become the conceptual subject of the cinematic representation. Can we turn on the sound? Aha, I was communicating with Linda about that. They speak about failing love, about jealousy, and what happens if one man falls in love with two women, and what does that mean for the dynamic of the trio. So this is right now the sound, which is a off voice. The making of the movement corresponds to the making of the images, which at the same time brings to light a making of perception. This was due to Rainer's insight that, I quote her, "Dance is hard to see." So the practice of rehearsal obviously served for a better perception of the construction of movement as the construction of the image, as the construction of the perception of the image. The performative topos of rehearsal should be not confused with free improvisation, but rather consisted of endless and scored repetitions which corresponded to the seriality of minimal art. In addition, the rehearsal served the performative research into, I quote Rainer again, changes in thinking about human beings and their environment. Significantly, we read from Rainer's manifesto resonances of those external, social, and discursive impulses that Butterfield-Rosen also cites as an argument for a decentering of the human in art around 1900. Resonances that arise from a mechanization that is not controlled by the subject, but by environmental factors of physical movements, which is also reflected in the automation of emotional impulses. That you should have heard that there is a kind of very neutral voice speaking about emotional chaos that rules the relationship between the three, but in a very neutralized sense. Significantly, it is not the music that determines the rhythm of the performance, but rather the discourse about love and jealousy as well as a cinematic apparatus. As Butterfield-Rosen's book shows, the decoupling of expression from body and emotion is not an invention of minimalism, but has its starting point in the post-human tradition of a certain part of the historical avant-garde, a tradition in which is about the mutual integration of human beings and their environment, as well as about the de-individualization, not to see the trans-individualization of figuration, which is a violent topic in dance and performance studies, for example, within the writings of Serbian theoreticians Bojana Cevcik and Ana Vujanovic. According to Butterfield-Rosen, there was already a striking analogy in art around 1900 between a lack of emotion and a lack of motion under the condition of de-individualized group ornaments. We saw this in the examples I showed to you. It is precisely in this that Butterfield-Rosen recognizes a decomposition of the human figure that is crucial from my view also of Silke's painting too. Because as we see in her representations of the physical movements, these are also static, sometimes decorative formal elements which have their origin in the photographic staging of bodies that we saw in the depiction of the Ballet Russe. Following Butterfield-Rosen, Nijinsky created a lavish picture album in order to translate dance into graphic media. The form of documentation served as a medium of memory as well as of visual scorings of the choreographies. Accordingly, the graphic representation of bodies and body movement in Silke's painting, and also the staging of landscapes, it's not only about choreographic images, can be read as a resonance of the photographic condition of avant-garde dance, a condition that makes the rejection of formalist medium specificity plausible from a historical perspective. Instead, the motives seem inclined to perform a different self of the medium as such. However, this does not mean that the demarcation of and from medium specifics implies an arbitrary or functional term of the painterly medium in the sense, for example, of conceptual art. Instead, we recognize in the represented styles of movement a formal equivalence to painting as a medium at a standstill. This means that the materiality of the medium determines the motives and thus also the organization of the image. One could say that the artist medializes the photographic apparatus inherent in the choreographic images through the painterly procedure she uses. Accordingly, we do not see illusionistic representations of historical performances in Silke's paintings, but rather de- and recompositions of photographic movement scores. Against this backdrop, in my opinion, a media-technically expanded view of the painterly rendering of photographs opens up our view on her procedures. Accordingly, the choreographic pictures figure a formal vocabulary that exposes the co-constitutive relationships between dance and painting. With that, I mean a mutual integration of movement at a standstill and of stasis in motion. The common denominator here lies in the nexus of repetition and reproduction, which linguistically and literally resonates with the procedure of rehearsal, a nexus for which Edgar Degas' endless rehearsal images provide vivid examples, because they show that the break diagnosed by Butterfield-Rosen around 1900 is the result of a longer development within modern painting. Degas' rehearsal paintings from the 1870s and 80s also rely on a mixture of drawing and snapshot photography. At the same time, Butterfield-Rosen's researches into psychological theories of movement around 1900 offers an expanded interpretation that, in my opinion, is also relevant to Silke's painting. As a result, the artists of the time tended to work with, quote, images of movements that impress themselves to memory most explicitly and durably, that is to say, movements of longest duration and minimum velocity, start points, midpoints, and endpoints, rather than intermediate phases. A striking example is Degas' La Répétition. Répétition in French is also rehearsal in English, from 1874, as it is a commemorative picture that was created a few years after the fire at the Paris Opera. So this rehearsal space was already destroyed and is visibly assembled from start points, midpoints, and endpoints. On the one hand, the rehearsals stand for the evocation of a presentist in the making. You see it on the painting, you see the dancers coming into the pictures, coming down this round staircase, then you see the middle part, yeah, the midpoint, and then you see the end point. And this is an evocation of as if we would see the making of the movement and could study it. Exactly what Yvonne Rainer said. Dance is hard to see. He makes dance us to see, but also the painterly process as a time-based process. And as I said, it's on the one hand the evocation of a presentist in the making, but at the same time, this always refers to the past tense of the production phases that is inscribed into the work. Of course, that is not a rehearsal piece, it is a representation of the rehearsal, but there is this tension, yeah, between the imagined in the presence of the beholding and the after. The rehearsal thus appears as a vehicle for the entanglement of two temporalities, that of the now and here of perception, that is the minimalist mode of perception, and that of memory, the mnemonic mode, yeah? The remembering, what do you have in mind after you have seen the image. An entanglement that speaks against a positive reversal and adaptation of Fried's concept of theatricality. Rather, we are dealing with a concept of medium that is determined by the temporal and spatial conditions of production and reception, which manifest themselves in the form and materiality of the literally rehearsed figuration. As Silke stated in our conversation, she always arranged the motif on the prepared surface, finding always the right scale and proportion in order to translate the drawing she made on paper onto the canvas. Her preparatory drawings are relatively small, and she made a lot of them to figure out the composition. The canvas sizes vary, but in her last years she had been interested in working on one painting across multiple medium-sized stretches of approximately 100 centimeter by 150 centimeter. We can see that in the show, emphasizing the movement between the panels. Next, she sprayed the painting with a fine layer of water to dissolve the paint she applied. Keeping the painting moving, she tried to control the drying process as much as she could, eventually placing the painting on the floor to let it dry completely. The dry painting left her with a trace of the initial drawing and a fine layer of pigment across the surface of the canvas. This was the ground for the next layer of painting in the motif and the removing and redistributing the pigment. After many repetitions, the areas of the motif that started out white primer accumulate enough pigment to appear very dark, a velvety charcoal color due to the many dried layers of pigment. In contrast, the areas that started black were and are now a washed out gray that shows clear traces of the process. As the artist continued to explain to me in 2019, in her then recent works, she preferred a specific pigment, lamp black, on the primed canvas ground in order to achieve a fine weave of the canvas. Therefore, the layers of acrylic gesso primer would produce a smooth surface that still has texture because the brush strokes are visible and because the surface is not too absorbent. Therefore, the dynamic texture of the optical surface is due to the addition of the light-dark contrasts, which evoke a graphic, not to say a photographic impression. Silke's paintings indeed appear as a result of, at the same time, regulated and purposeful, as well as an experimental and open procedure, based on graphic tracing and painterly dissolution of her photo-choreographic templates, as if the media transfer inscribed into the images would perform the paintings through the techno-material behavior imposed on them. By giving up control over the photographic references, the figuration always appears as the effect of a repeated but never completed predictable color process. Therefore, the temporalized and spatialized, respectively, the staged reception of Silke's paintings, let them read as reversed rehearsals. Accordingly, and in contrast to Fried's pejorative notion of theatricality, one could say that Silke's choreographic paintings incorporate the physical exercise of their making in order to remake the perceptual condition of the painterly surface. Just looking at the pictures obviously isn't enough. The way how they are presented, you see that in the wonderful show, encouraged us to look around the room in multi-directional way. Anyone who walks through the exhibition notices that every movement enables different sequences of figuration and surfaces, front and back sides of the pictures, evoking a scenography that is about the radical de-hierarchization of the relationship between the work, its surroundings, and its viewers, as if we put together optical and spatial vision frame by frame in temporary constellations of motifs and materials. Therefore, the idea of the reversed rehearsal thus doesn't prove two-dimensionality to be the non-illusionistic truth of painting, but rather reveals the indissoluble nexus of presence, memory, and projection. Walking through the space, we find and lose, find and lose again motives as if they would depend on perception exercise. The linking of physical movement and optical stasis doesn't allow to view Silke's paintings only as retinal, but forces us to perceive them as embodied choreographic images which connect the stage with the photographic archive. What if we viewed Bühnenbilder as a three-dimensional album full of frozen body movements in order to remember and reenact the remaking of the reception of painterly condition? Thank you.
Are there any questions in the audience? Otherwise, I have one. I was wondering, because this your presentation sits around a corpus of Silke's work, some of which is earlier than the exhibition here, how you see some of the lineages of your inquiry into the last body of work, those three paintings at the center of the show, where psychoanalysis and maybe a psychological subject appears in a different way than it does throughout the rest of Silke's work.
No, that's a very good question. I was also thinking about, but I left that out because I did not so much research into the last images, which also touch me a lot, I have to say. But I think there does happen something which is really has a new quality in her work, since the represented figures are interacting. That is something they don't really before. Therefore, I was speaking about this kind of trans-individuality, which is not necessarily about evoking a coherent or organic ensemble, yeah? And it's more a kind of accumulative staging of figures. And I was also thinking about, in a way, the question you just addressed, and I think it would be possible to discuss them through the lenses of Emily Butterfield-Rosen's reference to psychoanalysis. Since psychoanalysis, or the way she reads it, it's very much about the impulses and forces that are not inherent to the individual subject, but that is about a discourse on the human condition, and that is also about, she uses these words, I just quote them, primitive forces. It's not about the brainy, the intellectual, subject, but it is about the forces inscribed into the bodies by the ways how they socially interact. So there is a same or a similar argumentation that we could probably attach to them that is, again, not visible whether these kind of interaction these figures show are coming or deriving from their subjective position, but derives from kind of outer or external impulses and connections that are imposed by certain discourses within psychoanalysis. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? It wouldn't appear so. But I'm sure there will be ample opportunity to speak in the breaks and to have conversations throughout the day. I would suggest, how are we in terms of time? That we break for just a couple of minutes and then have the next lecture in 5 minutes or so. Saim Demircan will be talking. Thank you.